I want to welcome all of you to this video Drasha. This Drasha is a special one in preparation for the holiday of Shavuot, which begins this evening. That is Thursday evening. Shavuot is the holiday that commemorates the giving of the Torah. We say in the Kiddush, Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah. And I thought that what we would do in preparation for Shavuot is learn some Torah. Now, when we say we're going to learn some Torah, that doesn't mean that we're going to study the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Because when we say Torah, we mean both the written and the oral Torah. Now, the largest and most significant compilation of oral Torah is the Talmud. So, indeed, what we're going to be talking about in this drasha comes from the Talmud. And it's a very interesting story that gives us some insight into both the nature of halacha, Jewish law, and also how the rabbis of the Talmud thought about the Torah. So the story really concerns, or I should say the context for the story really concerns a technical issue. The technical issue has to do with something called the oven of Aknai, which was a clay oven. And there were differing opinions as to whether this oven should be considered a vessel or not. Now, what's the difference? Well, if it was to be considered a vessel, then that meant that it could become impure. If it was not really a vessel, then it could not become impure. Now, Rabbi Eliezer, one of the great sages of the Talmud, he held that this oven of Aknai should not be considered a true vessel and thus could not become impure, whereas Rabbi Yehoshua and the other sages held that it should be considered a vessel and thus could become impure. And where we're going to pick up the story, it says that all day long Rabbi Eliezer was bringing forth arguments for his case. These are halachic arguments, trying to persuade the majority of the sages that he was right. When they would not acquiesce to his view, finally he says, if I'm right, let this carob tree decide. Well, apparently out the window in the back of the study hall, there was a carob tree. And so all of a sudden, the carob tree gets up and moves. Some say it moved 100 cubits. Others say it moved 4. The sages say carob trees don't make halachic decisions. Then Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let the waters of this aqueduct decide. And all of a sudden, the water in the aqueduct behind the Bet Midrash, behind the study hall, began running in the opposite direction. Again, the sages say water doesn't decide, and the water started flowing back in the opposite, in the original direction. Rabbi Eliezer then says, if I'm right, let the walls of the study hall decide. And all of a sudden, the walls start coming in. So then Rabbi Yehoshua gets up and he says to him, you walls, what do you have to do with our discussions here? You have nothing to do with this. And so the walls stop falling in. But then the Talmud makes an interesting statement. It says, in honor of Rabbi Yehoshua, they did not fall completely, but in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, they also didn't go back completely either, so that they remained inclined. Then Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let heaven decide. And a voice comes out from heaven and says, don't you guys know that Rabbi Eliezer is always right? In all halachic matters, he's right. And Rabbi Yehoshua then gets up and says, the Torah is not in heaven. What does he mean by that? Well, the Talmud continues. It says that Rabbi Yirmiyah said that what it means is that the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, And it says in the Torah, in the book of Exodus, which is obviously the written Torah, it says that you should incline after the majority. So the concept of majority rule was already built into the Torah itself, which was given over on Mount Sinai. Now, the point of this story, it seems to me, is to say that the halachic decision-making process was one in which the rabbis understood that the Torah was revealed. It was revealed on Mount Sinai. But once it was revealed, once it was given over to us, it was our job, it was the job of the sages to interpret the Torah, to analyze cases as they came up in order to apply the Torah to those new cases in order to make halachic decisions. And that we don't sit around waiting for miracles or for voices from heaven as if somehow God is going to weigh in on these halachic decisions. No, the decisions are in our hands, and ultimately we have a halachic decision-making process. There are rules about how to interpret the Torah, and one of those rules is we go after the majority. And therefore, that is how halacha is decided. And so when we say, lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven, the point is to say that the Torah was given over to the Jewish people, and ultimately it is the sages among the Jewish people who make the halachic decisions. Now, I noted before in this story of interesting detail that it says that in honor to Rabbi Yoshua, the walls didn't completely collapse. And in honor to Rabbi Eliezer, they also didn't go all the way back up. They instead remained inclined. And this is also an important lesson because, anyone who has looked at the Talmud knows that there are many opinions on every question. There is virtually no question discussed in the Talmud on which there are not more than one opinion. And what we need to learn is to give respect to all of the sages, that when we come to disagreements, we need to respect each of the opinions, even if ultimately a decision is made one way or the other. One of the most famous instances of this is there were two great schools of sages. One was called Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, and the other was called Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai. And they agreed on many issues of Jewish law. And yet there's a statement in the Talmud that says the following, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These, the words of Beit Hillel, and these, the words of Beit Shammai, are both the words of the living God. And we can say, how can that be? If there's two opinions on a question of halacha, one of them must be right and the other is wrong. One of them must be conveying to us what the Torah really means, what God ultimately really meant, and the other opinion does not. And yet that's not the attitude of the Talmud, nor is it the attitude of Judaism. Rather, we say both are the word of God. Now, in a particular situation, this may be the opinion that is accepted by the majority, and hence that is the halacha. That is the view that we go by. But it doesn't mean that the other opinion has no value. And I'll tell you what part of this value is. In every age, in every generation for that matter, frequently, new questions come up, new problems, new issues that one is not going to find a clear answer to in either the written or the oral Torah. Let's say a question comes up, is organ transplantation permitted by the Torah or not? Now, we would say that there is a correct opinion on this. Ultimately, the Torah does answer all questions. But you're not going to look in the written Torah, and you're not going to look in the Talmud and find any discussion about organ transplantation. Obviously, they didn't have this question. So how are these things decided? Well, we have sages, we have rabbis, who first of all have the medical expertise. That would be the first requirement. In order to reach a halachic opinion about an issue that relates to medicine, you need to know the facts. You need to understand what are the issues involved from a medical point of view. And ultimately, you also need to know what are the applicable principles and ideas and precedents from the Torah, both the written and oral, that would apply to this question. So these things are complex, and they require experts, people who are both experts in the issue that's being discussed and in the history of Jewish law and of how these cases have been decided. Well, the fact that the Talmud preserves for us the discussions of numerous cases and issues and preserves for us both the opinions that were accepted and those that were not accepted and the arguments on both sides, ultimately that gives us an illustration. It gives us a model for how to go about making halachic decisions. And so part of the key to making a halachic decision about a new issue that comes up, something that was not dealt with before in the sources, is to look for the right model. Is there some analogy? Is there some case that we can find where the same kinds of issues, the same kinds of halachic issues would be involved, and then we can learn from that how to apply those principles to this new problem that has been presented to us. And so that's a good reason why the Talmud preserves both majority and minority opinions and the discussions on both sides, because that gives us the model of how to proceed in making halachic decisions. And so that, I think, is illustrated for us very nicely in this idea that the walls remained inclined, to show that, ultimately both sides have value. Both sides need to be respected. By the way, I want to just give you a similar idea that is really on a different subject. But a mezuzah is also put at an incline, right? If you look at the mezuzah on your house, usually we put the mezuzah on an angle, at an incline. And I heard a nice explanation of this once, and that is, we might have argued that the mezuzah should be put straight up and down. Or we could argue that the mezuzah should be placed horizontally. And so the decision was made to put it in the middle, in a diagonal, so that we understand that sometimes we need to compromise. And that's particularly significant for a mezuzah on the entrance of our house, so that when we come into our house and we're going to be relating to our spouse or our children, our parents, but particularly when we're relating to our spouse, that we should look at the mezuzah and see that it's at a diagonal and say, you know what, the truth often lies in between. You have your view and I have my view, and we need to reach some compromise. So I hope that these ideas have perhaps provide you with some food for thought for this Shavuot. I want to wish everyone a Chag Sameach, a happy holiday, a good Yantiv, and again, I hope everyone is staying safe, and I look forward to seeing you all in the near future. Good Yantiv.